According to numbers from the EIA, which is the US Energy Information Administration, 80% of the energy consumption in 2019 was based on fossil fuels, and the emissions from the North American continent are substantial and increasing. Dr. David Daniels is the Chief Energy Modeler at the EIA, working to ensure internal consistency across the agency's energy models. His main priority is to provide solid knowledge so that sound policies can be carved out. He's now going to share some of his knowledge with us, and I wonder if he sees any change ahead as the sun now rises above Washington, D.C. David, the screen is all yours.
Hello. I'd like to thank the organizers of the NTNU Energy Transition webinar series, both for putting the series on, and if you've missed the previous entry in the series, I encourage you to go look at the recordings from that and stay tuned for future installments. And also for inviting me to share some of the EIA data here with you today on the future of fossil energy. I hope to bring a little bit of a US perspective to this. I work for the US Energy Information Administration, which is a part of the US, an independent statistical agency within the US government. We're responsible for collecting and publishing information on the energy system in the US and abroad, and for publishing projections. All the data that I'll be showing here today comes from EIA data. Now, before I show you the data, I have a couple of caveats. The first is that everything I will show you is from publications that we produced pre-COVID. So none of the pandemic responses are incorporated into the information I'll be sharing with you today. Also, that the EIA reference case, which is mostly what I'll be talking about today, is not a forecast for the future. It's not a prediction of what's going to come. It is a projection, that's what we call it, which is meant to be a kind of a baseline against which to measure change. So if we're seeking to measure change, we can't put the change into the baseline. So specifically, we have no new laws or regulations. The laws and regulations that are on the books, we assume stay on the books as written. There are no extensions or no additional laws or regulations. And there are no technology breakthroughs. So no new shale revolutions, no new breakthroughs in battery technologies or CCS or hydrogen fuel cells or any of those things. Now, we know that there will be new laws and regulations, and we're monitoring the discussions that are happening right now. People are talking about extending the subsidies for wind and solar production. We know about those things, and as soon as they're passed, we will incorporate them. But we don't put them in the reference case. We also know about technologies. We're monitoring those as well. We see that there's a lot of R&D being spent. Some of those investments will pay off, presumably, with technology breakthroughs. But until they happen, they aren't incorporated in our reference case. So the reference case becomes a baseline against which to measure the change from when these things happen. So the quote from Charles Dickens, this is Ebenezer Scrooge, right, when he's visited by the spirit of Christmas yet to come, and he's given a vision of the future, and he asks the spirit, are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only? Well, the EIA reference case is absolutely shadows of things that may be only, and in fact, they're not even very likely. So here's, in a nutshell, the future of fossil fuels in the US. This isn't consumption, this is actually energy-related carbon dioxide emissions, but it's a useful place to look at the future for fossil fuels. EIA only projects forward through 2050, so everything you'll see in here goes through 2050 and stops. We don't say anything about what happens beyond that because we haven't analyzed it. Fossil fuel emissions, the left-hand side shows emissions from different sectors, the right-hand side shows the fuels that do the emitting. I want you to notice two things about these charts. The first is if you added up all the emissions, you would get about 5 billion metric tons in 1990. That would grow to about 6 billion metric tons by the mid-2000s. I think the peak was in 2007, and then it declines. By 2020, it's expected to be back where it was in 1990, 30 years ago, 5 billion metric tons. And we're continuing to decrease in emissions, but EIA projects that that decrease will come to a slow stop around 2030 or so, and then start to increase again. By 2050, we're almost back to 5 billion metric tons. So the first thing to notice is that 1990, 2020, and 2050, from an emissions standpoint, look very similar, about 5 billion metric tons. So one answer to the question of is there a future for fossil fuels is that, well, yes, without any additional action being taken, 2050 looks an awful lot like today, and that looks an awful lot like 1990. The second thing to notice about these is that some of the shapes on the left and the right are very similar. Transportation looks very similar to petroleum. That smile shape in the future is very interesting, and I would love to go into that, but that would take up all the additional time that I have here today. Electric power looks a lot like coal. Well, that's no wonder. In the US, coal is predominantly burned for the production of electricity. The growth in the industrial sector on the left-hand side matches the growth in natural gas consumption on the right-hand side. Again, natural gas is used very heavily in the industrial sector. So I want to go into two other stories here. One is on natural gas. I want to talk about that one a little bit, and then I want to talk about electric power because the shapes of those two are pretty interesting. One increasing, one decreasing, and then staying kind of flat. The natural gas story is a supply story. Here we have natural gas production from the US on the left, and we can see that historically, if you had extended this backward in time, you'd see a long, slow decline in natural gas production, hitting its nadir in the mid-2000s. 2005, natural gas production was about 18 trillion cubic feet. By 2019, it was up to about 35 trillion cubic feet, almost doubled in about 15 years. EIA projects that that natural gas production will continue to grow throughout the projection period through 2050. The rate of growth will slow down, won't be as fast as it's been in the last 10 years, but it will continue to grow. And this despite historically low prices. The right-hand side shows the natural gas spot price at Henry Hub, and you can see that historically it's been in the range of, $5 to $10 per MMBTU. And these are annual average prices. This is not a short-term fluctuation because of a spike in the weather or something like that. This is an annual average price. Today, that price is around $2 per MMBTU. And EIA projects that although it will grow slowly into the future, it'll never actually get back, not through 2050, it won't get back to even $4 per MMBTU. That level of price is historically very, very low. And yet, despite that low price, we still have production growing. So what that means is in the US, we are now in a world with very low and abundant, low price and very abundant natural gas. Well, wait a second, I hear you say, what about renewables? What about wind and solar? Sure, your natural gas prices are low, but they're increasing over time. Wind and solar costs are declining. Shouldn't they beat out natural gas? Well, that's an electricity story. So let's look at electricity now. The left-hand side shows the production of electricity in the US by source. And you can see that renewables are in fact growing the fastest. They're doubling in their share from 19% to 38% over the projection period. And the right-hand side shows the breakdown of those renewables into the different types. You can see that almost all of the growth is in fact wind and solar. Now there's a couple of things to notice about this chart as well. First, that wind and solar growth, although there are state and local mandates for shares of wind and solar, the growth that we're projecting exceeds those shares. We produce about twice as much wind and solar as is required by state level mandates. So what that means is that wind and solar are coming in economically. They're coming in because they're cheap, not because they're required to come in. They come in, they're about 80% of total renewables, that's the right-hand side, 80% of the 38% on the left-hand side is about a third. So wind and solar is about a third, makes up about a third of generation by 2050. Yet, even with that growth, if you look at the non-renewables, the total generation from non-renewables in 2050 is almost exactly where it was in 2020. So renewables, with all of that growth, is essentially keeping up with the demand growth for electricity in the US, but it's not pushing out other sources of generation. Now, this differs from other places in the world. Let me show you two others as an illustrative example. First is OECD Europe. If you look at the right-hand side, the top of those bars, you can see that the growth in electricity demand in OECD Europe is relatively low. It's about the same as the US. The left-hand side of this is the US. The right-hand side of this is OECD Europe. So demand is very similar. Wind and solar share in OECD Europe is growing faster than it is in the US. By 2050, it gets to about a half. Remember, in the US, it was about a third. In OECD Europe, it's about a half. So with similar demand growth, but larger share of renewables, you can see that on the right-hand side of this chart, renewables, wind and solar, are pushing out essentially the fossil fuels. That's the big difference between OECD Europe and the US. But compare OECD Europe now with India. India's share of wind and solar also starts at relatively modest levels and also grows to about half of generation, taking share from, in this case, coal. Yet on the right-hand side, the growth of electricity demand is so much higher in India that even though it loses share, coal's total amount of generation more than doubles between 2020 and 2050. The difference, obviously, between OECD Europe and India is the level of demand growth. So net-net, when renewables grow, in some regions they push out fossil fuels, in other regions they don't. And the big difference, other than the rate of renewables growth, is the rate of energy demand growth, essentially. If you put all this at the global level, we find that this is the global primary energy consumption. If you look at the left-hand side, you see that renewables are growing faster than any other source. And by 2050, they become the #1 source of primary energy. They're the primary energy source. Yet, they don't grow fast enough to prevent the growth of other forms of energy, including fossil fuels. Now, I don't mean to say any of these things to discourage anyone. We had a president about 60 years ago who said, to state the facts frankly is not to despair the future nor indict the past. I don't mean to despair the future. But like Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, we are given the opportunity to see one vision of the future. This is one vision of the future if we didn't make any change. We now have the opportunity, like Scrooge did, to make change. I thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions and comments afterwards.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that glimpse into the future as you see it in the US. And I was a bit intrigued by one thing that you said, that renewable sources and I think it was when it comes to electricity production, that it does not push out fossil fuels in electricity generation, to be precise. Whereas that happens in Europe and in other parts of the world. How do you explain that? Why is that happening? Is it because people are using more energy than they should, or what is it?
I don't know about more energy than they should, but as I said in the talk just a minute ago, whether renewables growth alone is sufficient to drive down the generation from non-renewables depends on two things: how much renewables grows. We saw the difference there between OECD Europe and the US, where OECD Europe was growing faster than the US. So obviously you'd expect it to have more of an impact on the non-renewables. And the other thing was growth in electricity demand. So both in the OECD, in the developed part of Europe and most of North America, in fact, electricity demand growth is relatively low. In a lot of other parts of the world, the developing world, electricity demand is growing very, very fast. So there, the requirements for renewables to be the way that fossil fuels decline in share, the bar is much higher for renewables. They would have to grow faster than demand growth, but demand is growing very, very fast. So it makes it a very challenging job for renewables alone to do.
But you also mentioned that in the States, the electricity production is higher than the mandates. I think you mentioned actually demand. Wouldn't that tell us that there is a huge potential for more generation and production?
Well, what it says is that there is a lot of potential, and EIA is projecting that a lot of that potential will be satisfied with additional wind and solar. The point of that is that the mandates themselves, depending on how you look at it, are either not very ambitious or not very complete. These are state and local mandates, right? So this is a patchwork, a kind of a quilt of different regulations at the state and local level because there's no national level mandate in the US. There are some national level incentives that I referred to briefly. They're slated to ramp down in the short term. If those are extended, right, then one of the implications is if wind and solar are coming in for economic reasons and you extend economic incentives, then you would expect those incentives to have an impact. If the opposite had been true, if the reason we're building wind and solar is simply to meet slated mandates, but they're out of the money, let's say, then making them slightly more in the money by extending federal tax credits, for instance, to them, might or might not have any impact on how much they grow.